May, who couldn't seem to stop looking at the new boy, pointed at Jack, talking the whole time. Jack reluctantly moved close enough to hear what she was saying. I'm so glad I went back up there like you suggested. Because the giant just yelled and out it came. The princess said, barely breathing during her story. I'm not really sure what happened yet, but... And then she stopped in mid-sentence. Jack! She yelled as he reached them. May grabbed his arm and pulled him closer. This is Philip! She nodded toward the purple-caped boy. The princess seemed to be almost glowing, which Jack frankly found to be a little ridiculous. Jack stuck out his hand, but Philip only greeted him with a nod. Sorry, Jack, is it? Philip asked, not moving from his spot. I would normally be glad to make your acquaintance, but I happen to be a bit preoccupied at the moment. Oh, really? Jack said, letting his ignored hand drop. And what is it that you're doing exactly? Philip nodded up to the giant above him. Well, presently I am slaying this monster here. He winked at May, who smiled widely at him. Jack raised an eyebrow. Huh? He said again. He's slaying the monster, Jack, May repeated unhelpfully. Jack looked from Philip to the giant and back. Oh, well, of course, he said. Any idiot can see that that's exactly what you're doing. Nini helped slaying the giant. As soon as the words left Jack's mouth, the giant let out an enormous roar. Louder than when Jack had stabbed his tongue. Suddenly, the monster's legs began to wobble back and forth, the tremors growing more and more violent until the giant completely lost his balance. Arms windmilling around and around, the immense creature toppled forward, collapsing toward the forest floor. It felt like the giant took forever to fall, but in reality, it was slightly shorter than that. It did take a few seconds before the top of the giant hit the ground. And a few seconds after that, for the ground to rise like a wave in the ocean and come rushing straight for them. Look out! Jack shouted, grabbing May's hand and running toward the nearest tree. He hoped to get them to higher ground. But there was no time. The ground curled up under them and tossed them both through the air as if they were rag dolls. Jack landed hard, but not as hard as May did when she crashed down right on top of him. As Jack struggled to breathe, he took little comfort in the fact that the princess seemed to have escaped harm by landing on him. Clearly someone somewhere had it in for him. As Jack sucked in air, the new boy pulled the princess off him. Philip then offered Jack an outstretched hand and a wry smile. I do not believe I will need help with the giant after all, Philip said, but perhaps you could use some? Jack grunted and reluctantly took Philip's hand. The boy had a surprisingly strong grip. Of course he did. Is the giant May said, glancing over at the fallen monster. Slain? Philip asked. Oh yes, quite. Okay, but how? Jack said, wiping his dirt-covered hands on his pants. For some reason, that didn't seem to help at all. Mostly because his pants, his tunic, and every other part of him was completely covered in dirt and dust from the ground's tidal wave. Glancing over at Philip, Jack wasn't at all surprised to see that the boy's white tunic and golden pants weren't even smudged. Of course they weren't. Quite simple, my friend, Philip said in answer to Jack's question. Before you and your delightful friend here happened along, I had hunted the large fellow, following him for days. I finally caught up to him here, and he, of course, tried to devour me. Before he could catch me, however, I challenged him to a series of contests to see which of us was the more powerful. I won each contest, mostly by tricking him, I must admit. Then I convinced him that I could turn myself to stone, standing unmoving for a longer period than he could. He tried to do the same, but I knew he could not do so as long as I could. You made him fall over by making him stand still? Jack asked, trying to wrap his head around the idea. His head just didn't seem to stretch that far, though. When fighting giants, young Jack, you must know your enemy, Philip said. I know, for example, that a giant's body cannot support itself when standing for long periods of time. Given its extreme size, a giant's bones simply cannot hold its own massive weight, not without equal hours of rest. I also know that giants view humans as their inferiors, and therefore this one would not let himself be beaten by me. In effect, all I had to do was defeat him several times to force him to move beyond his natural limits in an effort to humiliate me. His stubbornness was the true cause of his death here, as much as I might like to take the credit. So, he just tired himself out and fell over? May said. Jack was glad to see that she was beginning to question Philip's story too. The prince nodded. In essence, the bones in his legs could no longer support his enormous size. A fall from such a height tends to jumble what little brains they have, killing the monsters. I knew that the creature must topple sooner or later, and fortunately for my own legs, he said, smiling wryly, it was sooner. How long did it take? Jack asked, not able to contain his curiosity despite his already intense dislike for Philip. Philip looked up to the sky as if he had to think about it. He said, not longer than 4 or 5 days, I would say. 4 or 5 days? May said. Philip shook his head. Killing giants is not for the easily fatigued, my friends. Or anyone with a real job, Jack said. Philip's face clouded a bit. Pardon me, he said. I asked why were you hunting it, Jack said. Philip's face grew solemn. That is my quest. I hunt down the few remaining giants in our lands ever since my father was killed by one. May stepped over to Jack, her eyes on fire. Right. His father, she said to him. Didn't I tell you? Tell me what? Jack asked. Philip smiled politely, then stepped away to a corner of the clearing where a large purple bag waited. He sat down and reached into the bag and pulled out some bread and began eating it. Jack noticed that Philip bit into it far too politely for someone who hadn't eaten for 5 days. Philip's father won a kingdom for himself by killing giants, May whispered to Jack. Can you imagine? Supposedly his dad took down 7 giants with one hit or something. How crazy is that? Okay, his dad killed giants, so... Jack said, knowing where this was going, but not willing to help it get there. Don't you get it? May whispered, a smile spreading over her entire face. If his dad was a king, that means Philip is a prince.